So, growing biennials for seed with our presenter Bill Braun from Ivory Silo Farm in Westport, Massachusetts. Bill is the co-owner. Would you call yourself co-owner?
Co-farmer.
Co-farmer of the Ivory Silo Farm and the Ivory Silo Seed Project. Two separate entities, correct?
Yes, Ivory Silo Seed Project now graduated into the Freed Seed Federation, which I'll introduce briefly when we get into it.
Fantastic. And I'm very happy to host Bill, and Bill's also a former NOFA Mass board member.
Proudly alumni.
Part of the alumni, and we're glad for that. I want to give thanks to our sponsors. All of these sponsors support our conference. We're very grateful for their help and their support. Feel free to reach out to these sponsors, of course. We are presenting, attending, and hosting this workshop from land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those whose land you now occupy. The link for this map, which is a fantastic resource for you to check out, is here pictured. I will also post it in the chat, and you can click on it, and it's interactive. You can drill down into it and find out where you are at and what the native culture was before this land was colonized and developed. I am presenting this workshop from land formerly managed and inhabited by the Wampanoags.
Welcome, everyone. I hope everybody is well during this time and staying safe and sane and heart-centered. My name is Bill Braun, as the slide says, and I farm with my wife at Ivory Silo Farm in Westport, as Jason mentioned, land that was taken from the Wampanoags. And here we are doing our part to heal that relationship and restore it. And the other component to Ivory Silo Farm is a nonprofit that we co-founded together, and I am executive director of, called Freed Seed Federation. And without going too deep into that, essentially, Freed Seed is a 501c3.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're not seeing your slides.
Here we are. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Good, great. Okay. So yeah, Freed Seed Federation, in essence, when we started Ivory Silo Farm, we had a penchant for seed stewardship and promoting seed for the public domain and regionally adapted seed in a time of climate disruption and corporate consolidation. And piggybacking that on the market garden after a few years was tiresome, and one was doing a disservice to the other. So we, at the behest of peers in the nonprofit world, incorporated in the fall of 2017 into what is now Freed Seed Federation. And so we do our best to foster and promote all things seedy. Place-based seed for the commons is sort of our tagline. That includes participation in rematriation of seed back to indigenous tribes. If you're interested in that, my contact info is at the end. Feel free to drop me a line. We are also actively engaged in a number of participatory plant breeding projects for organic farms in the Northeast with farmers, homesteaders, and gardeners. If you're interested in that, please also drop me a line after this. But today we are going to talk about biennials. And I thought the best way to dive into biennials is by way of brassicas, because two of the brassicas that we focus on our farm for biennial seed production are essentially the two ways that one would go about growing seed for a biennial. There are nuances to the process between different species and families and so forth. But basically, one we're digging up and putting back out, and one we're leaving out over winter. And so we'll talk about both of those. So what is a biennial? I'm going to start before I jump in with the assumption that we're all more or less on the same page with the importance of seed stewardship and seed sovereignty. That has been a past workshop of mine with NOFA and elsewhere, and I'm happy to talk about this with anybody else offline at another time. But if I'm leaving gaps in my assumptions here, again, please feel free to stop me or just ask questions at the end. So backing up, a biennial is a vegetable or is a plant that grows vegetatively over the course of one season. So season 1 for a biennial is all about storing carbohydrates in the storage tissue, whether it's a root or a bulb or a foliage or a stalk or a combination of all of them. Biennial sets flowers and seeds on its second season of production. And to do that, it requires a period of vernalization, which essentially is a fancy word for a period of cold. The general rule for a period of cold is anywhere from 8 to 10 weeks at somewhere lower than 50 degrees. Every biennial has its own nuances. Some weaker biennials, quote unquote, will vernalize at warmer temperatures. Others require a slightly colder temperature. So our baseline is basically anything that we are not familiar with that we're doing for the first time as a biennial. We're giving 10 weeks at low to mid 40s storage. And there are a number of ways to do that, whether it's a cooler, whether it's outside, although you have plenty of 50 and 60 degree days in the winters these days in southeastern Massachusetts. Still pretty much reliable, but that is what constitutes a biennial versus an annual, which is seeded, goes to flower, fruits, and sets seed all in the course of one season. So we're talking about 2 seasons instead of 1. Why biennials? Why do we want to save seeds from biennials? Well, some of us just think they're beautiful. So I didn't put beauty in there, but that's the obvious implicit first need for it. There is a need for it in the sense that because of the cost of producing biennials on a commercial scale, there is not as much attention put into biennials as there needs to be, particularly open pollinated biennials, particularly regionally adapted open pollinated biennials, and particularly biennial brassicas. There is an increasing use within the brassica family of what's known as CMS, which is cytoplasmic male sterility. It is not considered genetic engineering in the United States because it is within the same species. You're not putting the DNA of a flounder in a strawberry. But in essence, it's something that does occur in nature of its own accord, but this form of CMS that's happening in the seed production world is done in a controlled environment where the male pollen is irradiated so that you can have precision with applying the male pollen to a female pollen. This is not, I'm not casting a judgment on this. It is very accurate and very useful to a point, but it means things that we would like to save seed from within the brassica families are increasingly difficult, and especially if we're commercial growers. For those of us who rely on hybrids, we have stepped up our martyrdom game on our farm. We only grow open pollinated varieties, partially because our farm is a living lab for a lot of the seed work, but we're seeing an increase of F1 hybrid varieties of brassicas, and especially CMS F1 hybrid brassicas. So if you love brassicas like I do, we all grow them, then there's an special need for brassica biennials. But any of the biennials in general just need some TLC. We think the selection fits well with the timeline of a farming season. Most of us who are growing commercially or who are seriously homesteading, it's hard to think that anything fits in the timeline of the growing season. But what's beautiful about biennials as compared to saving tomato seed or squash seed is either isolation, hand pollination, or time, or a combination of the 3 in the summertime is much more difficult than growing something for a year. And then when you're getting into the cold season, that's when you're doing your selection. So the selection pressure is not really on in the midst of the season as it would be for annual crops. I think that happens to be excellent because if you're growing beets, you grow your beets, and then you pick your most marketable beets and you store them intelligently, and then you plant them out. And you've done selection at a time where the pressure's not on to keep your head above water for other things, or the bumblebees haven't beat you to that squash blossom and now all bets are off. So I think that happens to be one of the many virtues of growing biennials for seed. And then also, to reiterate the obvious, all seed crops, all flowers are pollinator habitat, but early pollinator and beneficial habitat is excellent for biennials. You know, you're talking about getting really nice blooms at a time where foraging is somewhat scarce unless you have a lot of hedgerows or other wildflowers around, or you've planted early perennial flowers or something like that. So pollinator beneficial habitats galore. Many species of beneficials, too many to name. Hoverflies, micro wasps of all sorts, blue bottleflies, syrphids, braconids. They love brassicas. They love umbels. They love all these biennial crops that we're growing for seed. So for those of us who are concerned about our insect allies, you have a de facto habitat just by growing seed, especially with the biennial timeline. So we're going to start by talking about the Macumber turnip. This is my baby. This is a Westport heirloom, South Coast heirloom. Jason and many others have heard me talk about this every opportunity I get, because by farming in the area that I am farming in, inherited an unbelievably wonderful heirloom. This is something that, like many heirlooms, since 1787 has been handed down by farmers and gardeners in the South Coast. It's only been offered recently in Seed Savers Exchange upon the passing of one of the old-timer farmers who bequeathed his seed stock to Seed Savers Exchange. And I can tell you by the pictures and by growing the Seed Savers Exchange stock side by side, it doesn't look as beautiful as that. And so when I came into biennial production, there was a need to bring this turnip back to scale, because most of the people who were growing it were saving the rest instead of the best. The best were going to market, and what was left to winter over became the seed stock. So this has been a stewardship preservation project of ours for a decade now. And I can talk about its many, many virtues. It is one of the only vegetables in the country that has its own plaque. There it is, Main Road, Westport, Massachusetts. It's too blurry because I can't take pictures well, but there it is. So we're going to start with that. And we're using the turnip as the example of a biennial that, although the Mecklenburg turnip can overwinter and has overwintered for many, many moons outside, there are two reasons why we don't leave ours in the field to overwinter. One is that despite our best attempts at all things fencing, deer after Thanksgiving are very hungry. And when they discover a patch of turnips, will happily eat the turnips to the ground, because as with many of the root vegetables, the starches convert to sugar when the weather gets cold, and they are a delicious snack and probably excellent for the deer's microbiome. The other reason is that the freezing events and the fluctuations in weather have been such that something as reliable as the Mecklenburg turnip, that in southeastern Mass, where Zone 7B, sort of the banana belt, as my good friend John Navazio calls us, it was reliable for many years that this could grow outside, even in very cold winters. But the oscillations of 50-degree temperature swings in the wintertime with a combination of coastal winds can really do a number on our seed production. So we found it easier to do the selection in the field, pull them up, and store them. And we'll get into how we do that in just a second. So there are two ways that we do selection. On our farm, we do a bulk harvest before we let the turnips get nice and sweet, so a couple mild frosts. And then when the big frost is coming, usually around early November, when it's below 26 degrees, we will pull everything up. These turnips, like many of the Brassica napus, rutabagas, and so forth, they're hardy to about 10 degrees outside without batting an eyelash. But when we do our big harvest is when we're doing our selection, tried and true, side by side. The picture you see here is part of Freed Seed Federation. We share seed with a number of participating farms, and then I go out when it's close to harvest time and flag the best turnips in their field. Some combination of these for you. It's an easy way to do it if you want. If you have volunteers or farm hands that you whose eyes you would prefer not to be doing the seed selection for you, you can go out. Some pink flagging tape works really well, something very obvious. Otherwise, at harvest time, if you are digging up with roots, it's easy to just do the selection in real time. From there, they go into storage. This is one of two options for storage. This is when we had a root cellar that was not really a root cellar. I think at one time it was a cistern and was drained and was no longer. And so consequently, we had some drafts coming in there on very, very cold nights, and things were freezing and thawing like crazy. You don't need to know that. But what we're trying to look at in this poor picture here is that we have big tubs. We're digging up our turnips. And if you look closely, you can see that we've pinched all the foliage off right down to the apical bud, which is the 1.5 inches or so right on the top of the stalk. And that's where your flower bud is going to emerge, your primary flower bud. On these turnips, they'll come all down the stalk and even up the turnips, but that's where your primary flower bud is. So you want to make sure that is intact. So when you're harvesting roots, do not cut the tops off like you are harvesting them for market. Because if you cut into that apical bud, depending on what it is, some things are not forgiving, and you may lose either the best seed or most of the seed by doing so. So we then take these and very carefully put them into storage in some wet sand. And then we just check on them over the winter time, pinch off the yellowing leaves. They're actually very sweet in the winter time, so they're somewhat of a delicacy if you have a very high-end restaurant. If you were unfortunate, as we were, to have restaurants as your primary customer pre-COVID, then hopefully when they are running at full capacity, if we see that in the next few years, you can share with them frosted turnip microgreens from your seed turnips. Go for it. Another opportunity here was we had an old farm stand that we retrofit to cure sweet potatoes in, and it became a quick pinch storage unit. You can see here that it's all insulated, and this will get down below freezing, but not much beyond that. Basically what you're looking for is a consistent temperature, something that's not having the dramatic temperature swings. So if it gets a little below freezing, at least in the case of the turnips and in most biennials, it's not too much of a concern. But it's very low tech, as you can see. It's wet sand. We've thrown everything in there. The turnips were not really cleaned at all too, so they still have some of their own soil on them. And once they go into dormancy, they're just respirating a little bit here and there. So periodically we would burp a room that's this insulated if the air is too stagnant, just kind of as good practice. And they last all winter. Then comes the spring. This is not the best picture, but it was the one I had readily available here. This is also a mulching experiment gone awry, as you can see. But basically what we're doing here is we are planting the roots out a little before or around the last frost. So for us, that's mid-April or so, or as soon as the ground can be prepped for it. And what we're doing is basically pulling the roots out of storage, sticking them in the ground and gently burying them a little bit and watering them in if needed. If the soil is saturated enough, then they're good to go. And we're making sure that we put our stakes in place at the beginning, because trying to put stakes, I mean, all of us who have done tomatoes know this, but it's just good practice to get the stakes in right away. Then you're not crushing plants as you're trying to wrap these when the windstorm is coming or when the hailstorm is coming and you're desperate. So that's basically what it looks like. Flowers emerge. After the flowers, we wait until the stalks are 2/3 to 3/4 dry. Reason being, brassicas have these little bean pods that most of us have probably seen if we've had brassicas go to seed in our farm, and they are a dehiscent seed pod, which means they shatter. So the best seed that you have is at the top, or excuse me, is towards the bottom of your stalk as it's making its way up the top. So if you're waiting until the entire stalk is dry, is brownish, beigeish, by the time you get to the top, those bottom pods want to shatter already. So we like to harvest just a little before that. So about 2/3 to 3/4 dryness, when most of the stalk and pods are brownish, beigeish. And then we're taking those out and we are cutting the stalks and laying them on a big tarp. And if the weather's nice, we'll let them air cure for a couple days. If not, then we will bring them inside somewhere, just to let them finish dry down if there's a little bit left. You can harvest them when they are dead dry, but you have to be very gingerly, especially if you have stake and weave or some other way of trellising that you're holding them up, because those pods will shatter and all your wonderful seed and all your efforts will be on the ground reseeding themselves come summertime. Sometimes you are forced to make immediate selection and pull everything up early. So what's happened here is an emergency picture sent to my wife and a van full of seedy turnips. We have had the privilege of birds, largely finches, visiting our farm the last few years because they love that we're a seed farm. And if you grow a lot of seed, this is something that you will have the privilege of enjoying as well, if you don't already with crows and things like that. So what we did here, we were scouting and we noticed that some of the pods that you can sort of see towards the right-hand side of the screen, they look yellow and almost like they're torn open. That is clear bird damage. The birds have chewed their way through. And once we notice that, we're making sure that enough of the pods are fat and green. So if the pods are green and swollen, they're already on their way to botanical maturity and they can get there with little help. So basically what we do is we pull the entire plant out instead of just harvesting the stalk. We clean up the very bottom of the roots, so we're not bringing dirt in with us, but we're leaving the root and the stalk otherwise intact. And we are hanging them upside down on ropes in our barn. I'm sure there are less lo-fi ways of doing this, and I encourage you to share them when you come up with them, but this is the most efficient way to date because we have the barn space and we have the string already there for other drying crops. So you can see the turnips themselves have had the dirty rootlets cut off and the taproot cut off, and the rest of the vegetable is hung upside down to dry. We'll check them every couple days, and once they're dry enough to the touch that they crack right open, we will slip a tarp right underneath, and we will gently hit them in place with one another so that all the seed is going onto the tarp underneath. Then we pull the tarp out, fold it up, and dump all the seed into a big bucket and go from there. But the main point here is that if you have birds, if you have problems, anything seems to be going awry, there are ways of saving your seed crop. And in this case, we're sacrificing quantity, we're still getting quality seed at the end of the day. We have various ways of winnowing so we can separate viable from non-viable seed. But if you did this at home and you were able to get things before the birds got all of them, then this method would work for most of your seed. So before I shift to kale, I can open it up for some questions right now if anyone wants to unmute and ask or clarify anything. I'm going kind of fast. Okay, so we'll move on to kale. Ta-da! This variety, or this species of kale is the Brassica napus or napus, just like turnips and rutabagas. The Macamber turnip is not a true turnip, Brassica rapa. It is a rutabaga, botanically speaking. So this is not Brassica oleracea. It's not your Tuscan kale. It's red Russian kale. This is a farm original gene pool that we have grown for a number of years. It's red Russian kale that I've been saving for years and years, back at a time where I was not as savvy with isolation distances, and a little bit of Macamber turnip is somewhere in that gene pool, and it doesn't express itself in the turnip side of things, but we see foliage from time to time emerge that is turnip-esque, and we embrace that. So that's a cross between red Russian and then white Russian, which is a superstar wintergreen from Wild Garden, Frank Morton, the great farmer plant breeder out in Oregon. And that had a lot of diversity inherent in it. And we are always looking to fortify any open pollinated varieties we are growing with as much diversity as possible, as much diversity as maybe the market will tolerate, or as the species is still doing what we want it to do and we don't have too much variation. But diversity breeds resilience in plants and people. We know this. So we've crossed these two together and we maintain this as an overwintered green in an unheated tunnel. And I think this is also a great example of biennials because this is sort of our shining example of how seed work can dovetail onto a market garden. We grow this kale for our winter markets. I just put that in there because my son photobombed it and I thought it was wonderful. Forgot that was there. You can see also there's a lot of diversity just even within the leaf serrations in this photo. A couple other photos I think I put in here. This is sort of like what I did on my summer vacation slide show here. Here we are. So we're transplanting for our market crop around mid-September, and we're letting the plants bulk up as we harvest outdoors, and the plants get nice and bulky, and we harvest all the way down to the Persephone period, the period of the lowest light during the winter, until they look more or less like this, and we're pulling maybe one leaf off a week until the dead of winter, in which we take a little break from them. Why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because one of the wonderful things about growing seed and adapting seed is not just that you're returning seed and the plants that we have co-evolved with to a sense of place, and they are learning your climate, your soils, your pest and disease, et cetera, et cetera. You can adapt plants to fit your harvest style as well, among many other phenotypic things. So we select this based on how aggressively we are harvesting it and leaving it be. So unlike growing a seed crop for seed production, where you would want to leave crops alone generally and let them go through their thing, so they're photosynthesizing as much and your seed yield is as high as possible, we are selecting in the environment of intended use. We're selecting in situ. And that means we're selecting plants that are happily responding to us, harvesting the hell out of them all winter and spring until they bolt, and still producing vigorous plants and seeds ultimately as a result. So I just think that's one neat thing that's worthy of mentioning as you're brainstorming about ways that seed fits into your own farm or garden. Spring comes, and before we start pulling plants out or harvesting the less desirable ones to the ground, we make sure we help ourselves to some delicious kale rob. Hopefully we're not waiting at this was not a seed production year. If we're waiting until this budding stage to start roguing plants out, we're really getting close. We really want to do a lot of that roguing, and by roguing I mean pulling out the unwanted plants. We want to be doing that through the winter if something's really standing out, but then definitely before things are starting to get to this point in the spring. That way, once everything is bolting and starting to flower, we can just let it be and be happy with whatever's there. My friend and mentor, the great John Navazio, reiterated something that a mentor of his in grad school told him, which was, not everybody knows what they like, but everybody knows what they don't like. So roguing is as important, if not more important, than selection based on the things that you're looking for. Pull out the stuff you don't like, and whatever's left over is going to be pretty awesome, because whether we're selecting consciously or unconsciously, we're always selecting when we're growing seeds. So eventually, this is probably around, let's see, mid to late April, we're seeing the flowers emerge and all the pollinators. This is obviously a very hot day because everybody's a little wilty there, but the greenhouse looks like this. Because we're not focused heavily on summer production in our high tunnels, we're focused much more on winter production. We have the privilege of leaving these things to go to seed. But the thing about brassicas and a lot of other crops too is that if you're doing this for yourself, brassicas produce so much seed that you don't need to grow seed every biennial cycle. This one planting that we see in front of us will last us a decade if we wanted to. And if we keep the seed under the right conditions, the seed will be incredibly viable and retain a high germination rate for about that long too. So, you know, when you're thinking about ways that seed fits, it doesn't have to be every year. If you're doing active selection, especially with biennials, you want to keep that cycle going as much as possible, because we don't have the luxury of sending stuff off to Florida for the winter to grow for seed again and then sending it back, so that we're skipping an entire year. We do it the good old fashioned way in the greenhouses here. So long story short, this is what the flowers look like. Everybody comes to visit. We have honeybees on the farm. There are a ton of native pollinators growing every year, fortunately, at least on our farm. We have hummingbirds that also enjoy it, so it's not just for insects. And eventually we get to this stage. And what's interesting about this one, this is the first year that we did the cross between the red Russian, which is on the right-hand side, and the white Russian, which is on the left-hand side. And you'll notice that there are still a lot more flowers on the white Russian than the red Russian. So just something to consider if you're ever crossing things into a gene pool, making sure that even though things are the same genus and species, that those varieties are maturing around the same time, or at least flowering at the same time, so there's enough cross-pollination happening. So just another little blurb to keep in mind. This is an example of when we let things get pretty much all the way dry. We took it all out very carefully from our high tunnel, which you notice in the high tunnel, because we have wind protection, we were not tying them up the way we would out in the field. Not the best practice, but it works for us. And then we get back to this area. We let these out. If they're dead dry outside, meaning they're shattering right open with no coercion, then they're ready to go. And we either have a dance party on top of them, we can put another tarp on it and roll something heavily on them. We can get large seed sticks and swat at them, or the ends of hose or things like that. But you're just basically, you are threshing or thrashing, and you are smashing the seeds out of their pods. Eventually we pick this pile up, we throw it into our compost pile, and all the ripe seed is there sitting happily in the middle of the tarp. I should stop right here and just say that in terms of seed preservation, post-harvest handling, there are many sophisticated ways to keep seeds dry or to bring seeds down using desiccation packets or things like that. But the general algorithm that works in every situation is wherever you're storing your seeds before you put them in the jar, you want the temperature plus the relative humidity to be less than 100. So if it's a 60-degree day outside, I don't want humidity higher than 40% to really ensure that seed stays stored well and viable. So that's a nice little algorithm. The other way to do it, which is much easier, is what we call the thumbnail test. So if you take, let's say with Nebraska, it's a small seed with a larger seed like a bean or corn. You're digging your thumbnail into it, or you're trying to snap it. And if the seed snaps clean in half, then it's dried and it's ready to go. If you put a little dent in it and it doesn't snap, then it needs to be dried further. And we can talk more about post-harvest handling later, so I'm not assuming too much here. Let's see. So I think this is the last slide. This is a selfless plug for both the machine itself and for any of you who are in the southeastern Mass, Rhode Island area or are elsewhere and would like a drive. We received a grant from CMAP, which is Southeastern Mass Agricultural Partnership, to purchase the Winnow Wizard. This is something designed by a gentleman named Mark Lutera, who was a microbiologist by training and works on the seed farm of Wild Garden Seed with the great Frank Morton. And Mark realized in using old seed cleaning machines and combining that knowledge of how seed cleaning machines work with his knowledge of the hoods and the airflow in microbiology labs, that he could design something that could clean any seed. I mean, anything from amaranth to zinnia. You put something in there and this thing can clean it. And it's all based on a simple series of screens. There's no clean out time from lot to lot. So if anyone's tried to clean different kinds of seed with an old seed cleaner and has had to air blow all the little seed out of there that's jammed in every little crevice or corner, this is a literal game changer. And so I encourage you, if you're getting serious about seed production, to learn more about this machine. Come visit us if you'd like seed cleaned. We do an open threshing bee day on the farm in the fall every year. And we're happy to implement that outdoors with social distancing if need be this fall. And then we also can take private individuals coming on a scheduled basis to clean seed. So grow the seed, save the seed, and then come see us if you're getting to that scale where you need to clean seed on a large level. I have no idea where I'm at for time. Oh, 7:41, we have plenty of time. So I zipped through that a lot faster. This is just some information, my email address. freeseedfederation.org is the website that we have yet to add. So if you go on it now, there are some pretty pictures and a PayPal link that says give us money. You're happy to follow those instructions or find out more as the coming months go and we put more information up online. And I usually bring seed saving books with me. These are four sort of primary textbooks, so to speak, top to bottom. The most recent one is The Seed Garden, which is published by Seed Savers Exchange. It's co-edited by a number of people. It is to date the most comprehensive manual on saving seeds of all types, vegetables and some grains. The Organic Seed Grower by my friend and mentor John Navazio gets much more into the nitty-gritty of how to save and grow seed on a production level for organic systems. The Classic Seed to Seed by Suzanne Ashworth is what I and others sort of grew up with saving seed from. There is some material that's now considered outdated, but generally it's still an excellent and timeless reference. And then NOFA some years ago put together an organic seed production and saving manual for the Northeast as well, which has some great tidbits. So much for brassicas. I will mention before we dive in with questions, we do a number of biennials on the farm. We do chicories, beets, parsley, allia, leeks, and onions, and so forth. So I'm happy to talk about any of those or about brassicas in particular or anything to do with seed saving as 101 as it might be, as I assumed a lot in this presentation. So I will open it up to questions now.
Thank you, Bill.
Do I have to be chat? Here we go.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's fantastic. Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, I have some, Mike, I'm not seeing slides, from Christy to everyone. Do minimum number of seed producing plants. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, there is absolutely a number. Without getting too much into it, unless we'd like to, there is not, I would say, a one or the other, but rather a continuum between self-pollinating and cross-pollinating plants. When I say there's a continuum, there are a lot of things that are considered self-pollinating that would happily be visited by many bumblebees. And there are a lot of things that are obligate outcrossers, meaning they rely on pollen from other plants that can sometimes, in some cases, self-pollinate because nature knows no rule but the exception to whatever Homo sapiens schemes up. So when it comes to biennials, we're almost always talking about outcrossers, which means we want larger populations. If you're saving seed from peppers or tomatoes or beans or lettuce, all of those are largely self-pollinating crops, although some have a tendency to outcross very easily. Those you can get away with smaller populations. Anything that's an outcrosser has evolved from original natural setting in the wilderness through human stewardship to require other plants to remain viable seed. And so we're talking about a much larger population. And I would make two distinctions there. I would say there is a requisite amount of plants saving for selection, and then there is a requisite amount of plants saving for maintenance. So if you are doing seed saving of a variety that's already more or less where you want it, you're not making crosses, you're not doing selections or anything like that, you would want a large population, because every time you save from a population that's sort of too small, you are doing this. And what can happen with outcrossers is you reach a point where you have hit a genetic bottleneck, and unless you are reinvigorating with a different strain of the same variety, or you are bringing some other variety into this, then you will find that your once wonderful turnip is not such as it used to be. So that number for maintenance, most of the seed saving manuals for outcrossers will say anywhere between 30 and 60, but in talking with the great Dr. John Navazio, in his experience, decades and decades of working with biennials, he recommends a population of 100. If the population is particularly inbred for being an outcrosser, meaning it's very, very uniform, or once originally came from a hybrid, then you're talking more like 130, 150, sometimes even 200 plants. I know that sounds like a lot for anyone who is gardening or homesteading. I mean, how many people are going to leave 100 turnips after they've put up their larder for the winter? This is a great opportunity for partnerships. So the whole idea behind participatory plant breeding, which I won't get into too much now, is not just evolved around the relationship between farmers and plant breeders and bringing farmers back in as participants, but it's also from farmers to farmers. So just by way of anecdote, corn is one of the most notorious outcrossers. If you save 1 ear of corn from one plant every year for 5 years, you will have a much different looking corn than you did 5 years ago. And this is sort of the dawn of hybrid vigor, because corn just benefits so much from diverse pollination, and particularly in a hybrid setting. So in the days of yore, around the holiday season, this is a story from Will Bonsall, that Mainers in a certain county in Maine would go door to door, pre-COVID, and visit each other without masks. And they would bring some of their corn seed in a bag. And everybody's house would have 2 bowls when you walked in. And one bowl was the corn of the host, and one bowl was where you drop a little of your corn. So you grow your backyard planting of the variety of corn that everyone maintained up there, which I believe was a flint corn. It was a cornmeal variety. And you would bring your satchel and drop a little in every bowl, and take a little from that bowl and put in another satchel. And that way, a community was able to maintain something as prone to inbreeding depression as corn by doing so. So if you find a coterie of people who just love macrame turnips, which you should, because they're awesome, then everybody growing them together means that one person's not responsible for growing these roots if you're not on a commercial scale. If you are on a commercial scale, it's not that hard to do. I sometimes think that we justify our market farm because of the seed endeavors, but however one fits into the other, we have the requisite amount, but we're always bringing others in from other farms. And that's not just for the population numbers, that's also because the more you have sort of phenotype expression from other farms, other organic operations, or regenerative operations in our case, then the more diversity and expressions of excellence you're bringing into your population. So if you are doing selection on biennials, the number can be as small as 10 plants in the case of something like chicory, which is still very much a wild plant and has so much inherent diversity in it that if we're going from here to here, we still have plenty to work with. In something that's been really inbred, you really want to keep those margins as wide as possible. So for selection, I would say roughly 10 to 50 plants would be ideal, based on what you're selecting and based on if you're making crosses or not. For maintenance, at least 60, ideally somewhere between 100 and 150 plants. I hope that answered the question. And Mike has put one in. What was the reason for letting the kale dry fully and using the Tart method as opposed to hanging it? Great question. 2 reasons we let the kale fully dry was we didn't have bird pressure there because it was in a high tunnel, and for one reason or another, the birds did not choose to visit the high tunnel. The other was because it had dried down so well in the tunnel. You know, we were able to control the environment in a high tunnel, so we didn't have rain events to worry about. We didn't have, because we had ventilation in there, we didn't have excessive humidity per se. So we would let the kale get pretty dry that particular year where you saw it. And if you have that luxury where you can let it dry down as much as possible on the plant and you can move it as carefully as possible, we're using pruners and cutting plant by plant and gently putting them onto the tarp so we don't spill seed. Then your seed's basically ready. You can do your threshing that day. You can winnow off all the chaff and seed pods and pull the stalks out and shovel your seed into a bucket and you're done. So that's why it worked in that case. There's no disadvantage to letting the biennials dry fully in the field unless there's a concern about predation or there's concern about getting it out of the field without disrupting it too much. Any other questions for anyone? We have lots of time. Ask questions that you were afraid to ask. I encourage you. And I'm not going to put you on the spot because I just said that. But you want to talk about beets? You want to talk about chicories? Other overwintering crops? I'm happy to do so. I am here. Or if you want to talk about annual seed saving. If you just want the affirmation that we are a community of humans that are in it together and that we will get through this, there is no greater wonder than seed. So let's talk seed while you're all here.
Christy has a question in the chat.
One new message. Christy, do you try to prevent crossing with cross? Oh, excellent question. And Mike would like to hear about beet seeds. Great, we will do both. Christy brought up a great question for those of you who are not watching the chat. Do you try to prevent crossing with closely related wild plants, carrots and Queen Anne's lace, for example? Yes. I would say less so than when I started out. I have only saved carrots for seed once. We're not really in ideal conditions. Where we are, we have excessive humidity. We're in a drought right now, as we have been in years past when others have been in excessive flood. But despite that, the days above 75% relative humidity were record-breaking. So we have a lot of concerns about humidity, and some of the umbel crops can be very susceptible to rot and things like that with that kind of thing. So we've eschewed that, but I was mortified to save carrot seed for a very long time, and chicory as well, because there is a wild. If you're saving the class of chicories known as escarole and endive are a different species than what we call radicchio, treviso, castelfranco, those varieties of chicory, which are all Chicorium intybus, which share a species relation with wild chicory, which is ubiquitous along most roadsides in the Northeast and elsewhere in the country. After talking with the great John Navazio, whose words I trust, he was much less concerned about it because he said on the long timeline of saving biennial seed and growing out the next year, if something crosses with Queen Anne's lace, you know it pretty quickly, and ditto with the wild chicory. You have a plant that looks much different than its relatives around. I don't know if that necessarily justifies growing carrot for production seed if you have Queen Anne's lace around you. I think we still want to take into account that anything growing within a mile radius with the right pollinators and prevailing winds and things like that can be susceptible to cross-pollination. But we fortunately don't have Queen Anne's lace growing in the areas of our fields where we grow seed. We have them in other fields and along roadsides, and we have a wood break between that. So I would say try it and don't be afraid to do that kind of thing. But with anything, when it comes to isolation distance or varietal purity, so to speak, it all depends on how you're using it. If you're growing seed on contract for a seed company, then you want to make sure that variety is as pure as possible, because that affects those people who are buying it. It affects the seed company who took your merit at face value that you would grow this wonderful seed on contract for them. So it's really bad form to kind of say it's probably fine in any of those cases that you're growing for commercial production or a contract seed. It's also, as in the case of preserving rare and endangered seeds, or seeds that are hard to get, or seeds that you've worked very hard on developing a strain for, that is another instance where taking all the proper precautions necessary is extremely important. But that being said, I would bear in mind that as far as outcrossing with either other people's gardens or wild relatives, most of the numbers about isolation distances, as far as I understand, have been drafted by people who were doing research at land-grant universities where there are very big open fields. And particularly in the Midwest, there's only open fields in a lot of areas. So the isolation distance would be much greater versus where we are in New England, where there are a lot of different contours, wood breaks, and so on and so forth. So how much the variety needs to be pure would depend on how deep I would go with concern for cross-pollination, if that really answers the question or not. So I think that's all I'll say for that, if it was clear enough. I'm seeing, so Mike asked about how to save beet seeds. Beet seeds are, as far as year one goes of the biennial, it's pretty comparable to turnips. You grow the beets out. Overwintering, beets are less cold hardy than turnips are. So if you're overwintering, this is sort of the case with anything that you would want to overwinter out in a field or even in a tunnel in a colder area. The smaller the plant is, the more readily adept it is to overwinter. So once we have looked at something and know that this is what we want it to be in terms of the variety, the shape, the flavor, color, everything else, then we can, as we multiply the seed, grow it out a little more and have confidence that if we really want to get them outside in the cold, like in the case of chicories, that we can start seeding a month later than we would for our production seeding and have very small rosettes instead of the big, beautiful heads of chicory, because those rosettes will hang on much better through hell and high water outside. I mean, chicories are just, they're apocalypse food. Bitter is better. Please learn to love and embrace them because they are incredibly nutrient dense and they grow like a weed, and that's what we want for systems of agriculture. So size matters in that case, but beets, just because we're digging them up just like we are with turnips, we will let them grow to production size. And then when we're harvesting, instead of just lopping the top off, instead of like with a turnip, you have this long, long stalk, and then you have your apical bud on top of the stalk. With beet seed, with beet apical bud, it is right above the top of the beet. So you really only need to, if you have your knife and you can envision that I'm holding a beet, I really wish I had one around. I could probably run out and get one, but you can just envision that I'm holding it so we're not sitting here, everyone's not sitting awkwardly waiting for me. And you're cutting sort of upward in a triangle around the top of the beet. So there's this little point that's about an inch or so right in the middle of the beet. That is the apical bud, and that will be left intact, and you always want to be careful not to damage them. You're not throwing them into a bag somewhere or hard handling them otherwise. You let those overwinter, plant your beets out next year. Beets are definitely one that I would encourage a larger population even more so than some of the brassicas. Reason being that beets are just like their sibling Swiss chard and distant relative spinach, not so distant relative spinach. They are all dioecious plants, which means instead of having a flower that has male and female parts, there are plants that have male flowers and there are plants that have female ovaries. And so if you're saving 6 beets and 5 of those are male and 1's female, might want to start over, as much as I hate to discourage anybody from seed saving. So population is really important with beets. Beets are a wind pollinated crop too, so having good airflow. I don't have a picture here and I can't dig one up in time, but basically if you're doing beets in a tunnel, which we do just to avoid rain events, one of the hardest parts about growing beets is beets are coming out to seed maturity right around early August. And that's about the time when Mother Nature turns the water back on the last few years with us, where we've been in the drought for so long, and then we get several inches of rain right around seed maturity. So if you have some sort of protection with any seed crop, but especially with something that would be a little longer to maturity and would be a risk during rainy seasons or excessive humidity, we grow beets in a tunnel, but we make sure the tunnel has roll-up sides, is extremely well ventilated, not just to prevent seed-borne and plant foliar diseases, but also because beets are wind pollinated and require airflow. So a fan would do the trick too. It's only recently that we've begun to appreciate how much beets are not just wind pollinated, but like any plant that puts pollen out, insects will find it. And so hoverflies are an exceptional pollinator when it comes to beets too. So if you have hoverflies around already, or you want them around, grow beets for seed. There is a little off topic, biennial grasses. What is the ideal mowing schedule to ensure maximum seed deposition? That is a great question. I'm assuming we're talking about cereal grains and not wild grasses or pasture grasses, of which I know very little about. Well, in fact, I haven't mowed any grain crops either to ensure maximum seed deposition. That's a great question, and I have no idea is the answer. I would imagine, I know that people have had luck with this with milkweed recently, for those who want to encourage monarch habitat, that mowing at an age of adolescence actually promotes more vigorous growth. And if it's done on the timeline before the monarchs are arriving to do their thing, then can lead to better habitat. So I would say as young as possible without setting the plant back. So maybe early spring, but that is complete speculation, and I am not very well qualified to answer that. So I apologize. There are too many beautiful grasses in the world and too many beautiful vegetables in the world. And the vegetables have just won my heart when it comes to seeds. The grasses find their own way. All right, that's it for the chat questions. Does anybody else have verbal or chat questions that they would like to talk about? Is everybody excited to save seed now? I'm assuming most people have attempted it who are delving into the foray of biennials, unless you bold souls. Oh, a new question. Would like to hear your tips for saving onion seed. Well, I wish I had an onion with me as well. One of the things that you can always do as you're periodically checking in with saving seed, and this is not something that I mentioned with the turnips because they're already where we want and we're just basically maintaining the variety, is that you can cut into a root vegetable. You can basically slice it in half. And if you're keeping the half with the apical bud ahead, you can get a sense of what's going on inside your root vegetable, and you'll still be able to have the vegetable harden off, callus over, and put out roots. I wouldn't cut all the way into a radish or turnip. If you want to look at, say, the color of the radish or something like that, you can cheek it, which means you're cutting off a chunk on the side. And, ooh, and somebody added that they've been having great fun reviving the Southport Globe. Yes, we are growing Southport Red Globe this year. I don't know if you're growing the yellow or the red, but it is a fabulous onion, and it is one that has in great need of good strains. Red and white, excellent. Let's talk about that in a minute. Looking for the yellow, excellent. Okay, I'll back up and say there is a great seed keeper by the name of Sylvia Davatz. If any of you have met her, D-A-V-A-T-Z. And until recently, she was running Solstice Seeds up in Vermont. Sylvia is to call her a gardener homesteader, I mean that as a compliment always, but especially in her case, she does more with her postage stamp garden than I've seen anyone do ever. And she's created a network of people up in the Vermont area that are adapting and maintaining a number of different seed crops. But there's a focus on onions, and they have excellent strains of Southport. So I would strongly recommend finding Solstice Seeds or Sylvia Davatz, or if you email me privately, I can send you her contact info. She would love to share seed, and her onions have defied all our expectations. So back to tips for saving onion seed. The reason I bring up onions is particularly because we don't want, thank you, Jason, we don't want rot on the inside of our onions, and to have discovered that once we're planting them out. And some people are more particular than others about the way the onions form on the inside for cutting. So a way to observe onions is to cut the bottom third or so of the onion off. And then what you have is the apical bud and the rest of your onion. Let that cure so it dries up a little bit, and that will give you an opportunity to look inside your onion and see what's going on there. We have had populations that have already received that treatment, and we haven't had to rogue things out with that with the onions that we've saved historically. So we've only done a little bit of that, but it's a great, great tool. You could probably do it anytime you're saving onion seed just to check in and see what's going on. But yeah, so basically the bottom third to even a half. So I've been told you can just slice right off where the old roots were. That will harden over, new roots will form eventually. Onions benefit tremendously. They need the vernalization from cold, but keeping them cold and then waking them up for a couple days before you stick them out in the garden to prevent shock, we found seems to be advantageous. So we will keep our onions in a cooler just above freezing for the winter, the way that we do with our production onions. And that also prevents them from off-gassing ethylene too much and sprouting and ripening other things that are in your cooler if they're sharing space. And we will plant them out as early as possible. Onion bulbs are pretty frost tolerant, but we'll wait until the last sense of passing frost. And then we're lightly setting the onions on the soil surface, not burying them too deep, and hilling a little bit of soil on them so that the roots can find their way, and setting our stakes. And we do our onions the same way that you saw the turnips, the same way we do our tomatoes. We do the Florida weave with them. So 1 row of stakes, 2 onion rows per bed. We have, our beds are about 48 inches bed top. And so we have 2 rows per bed. If you want heavy onion sets, in terms of seed, you can give them more spacing, but shortly before the new normal arrived with the coronavirus, I was out in the Pacific Northwest for the Organic Seed Growers Conference that OSA hosts, and we walked some farms of seed producers out there, and I saw people planting onions at 6 to 8 inch spacing. They were cramming them in, and I thought, I've never seen this before. And they swore by it because they said when it comes time to trellising, everything is much more dense and stands up a lot easier than if they were given more space and they were to run out, and so on and so forth. So we went a lot closer on our onions than normal. We planted 2 rows at 8 inches spacing in row and trellised them up this year. Onions can be susceptible to a number of different rots, so it's good to keep an eye on them. The bulb is pretty much toast by the time the onion is setting its seed. So if you were to cut them early for one reason or another, I would cut right where the stalk meets the bulb and bring that inside to hang dry. And that's pretty much all there is to it for our onion seed production. This is all weather pending, of course. If you have a major weather event coming, get the seed out of the field and find a way to mature it, because if it's reached a certain point, there'll always be a certain degree of seed where you'll sacrifice quantity, but you'll at least have something and your efforts would be in vain. So don't try to tough it out, especially in the case of onions or anything that has globular or umbelliferous flower, where it's a composite flower and there's a lot of little flowers within that. Those are really prone to rot. So excessive moisture in there, especially around harvest time, can be curtains for that. So, so time it intelligently. And Sephra, I would love to talk at some point about reviving Southport. I think bringing you into the loop with Sylvia and others would be wonderful. Southport, for those who don't know it, was named after Southport, Connecticut, to my understanding. It was one of the staple storage onions in the country for a long time, as Connecticut was an onion growing capital. And you find them in Southport, Connecticut. I'm finding out real time that Sephra grows them in Southport. That is wonderful. Welcome home. Congratulations on bringing them back. Find a lot of these old varieties where the strain is deteriorated, because we're only talking about open pollinated varieties in this discussion, because those are the ones, unless you want a project or a rabbit hole that you're saving seed from, or sometimes a lawsuit, depending on how deep you go. A lot of OPs that are out there, especially the old classic OPs or heirlooms, production seed growers are not focused on quality. They know that that Cherokee Purple tomato is going to sell even if the strain sucks, because all of us who garden want a Cherokee Purple tomato if we're tomato lovers in our garden. So they're going on quantity. And so what happens is a lot of these things that at one time were an excellent strain are maintained by someone different or are consolidated, as 20,000 or so seed companies have consolidated in the last few decades, and be in the custody of a very large company who's just cranking out seed units. And unfortunately, a lot of these once excellent regionally adapted strains are grown elsewhere in the country or world. Think Waltham butternut for those of us who are in this area. So bringing Southport Globe back is fantastic. And I also want to use that as a springboard to say there is tremendous historical precedent, at least there's tremendous historical precedent pre-colonialism, but there is historical precedent in our region to grow seed. Just because Pacific Northwest or other areas have this super dry, good vibe production seed growing area does not mean we can't do it. It's all the more reason that we should be doing it, because among many other reasons we can do it, we need to look out for our best interests. And the collective buying power, I cannot say this strongly enough, of all the organic growers in the Northeast that want this one variety of spinach are not going to compete with those 4 big spinach mega farms on the other side of the country. They determine the trend. They determine what stays and what goes based on their demand. So because our buying power is so small nationally and internationally, we really have as much of a need as ever to focus on growing as much seed locally as possible and figuring out the nuances of saving it within our climate. Mike said, is there a good resource you can recommend for determining what heirlooms came from your area? That's a great question. My resources for that have been humans that I know. I've been fortunate in that way. I'm sure there's literature out there. I would recommend reaching out to Heron Breen of Fedco Seeds. Heron is in terms of Northeast seed, is sort of a walking encyclopedia. And I'm sure that he has literature. A lot of the things he's referenced about heirlooms from this area have come largely from things that are no longer in print or very, very old manuscripts that circulated. But there is one thing that I have that I can pull right off my reference shelf here. This is a book. Can you read that? Glare. It says Field and Garden Vegetables of America. And at Local Historical Society, thank you. That's Sefer. That's also a great, if you go to your local library, I'm sure there are historical documentations, particularly in farming communities. This is a book by a gentleman named Fearing Burr, F-E-A-R-I-N-G-B-U-R-R. And this was written 1863. This is a list of as many varieties as could be cataloged at the time. Heron is presenting here. Yes, I think he's doing hand pollination. But this is a great reference manual. I also fully agree, and I'm glad you brought it up, Sefer's comment that local libraries in rural communities will have oftentimes great documentation of heirlooms that once existed. So you got to do a little digging, and you can get this from hopefully someone besides Jeff Bezos, because he's got enough money. Find an independent bookstore and ask them to order it for you. But this is a great reference. It's essentially just a list of all the market varieties of vegetables that were grown and all the known particular varieties at that time. So it's a great little walk back in time. Other questions? Yes, Heron is presenting Wednesday at 5 p.m. Jason let us know. And Heron is a close friend of mine and also a collaborator at Freed Seed Federation. Christy, several websites, archive.org, biodiversityheritage. I am learning so much from you guys. This is wonderful. So if you're not in the chat feature, Christy recommended archive.org, biodiversityheritage.org, and hathitrust.org, H-A-T-H-I-T-R-U-S-T. And since the Neanderthal doesn't know how to screenshot, I am going to write those down with a pen for myself. Wow, the wonder of the internet. So the information's out there, people. Thank you for being diligent and finding it faster than I probably could have. Thank you for teaching me how to screenshot on a Mac. The teacher is the pupil. This is much more fun.
You can save the chat as well.
Okay. And Happy Trust. And Command Shift 4 for future reference. Thank you. Thank you all for this. This is wonderful. Yeah, admittedly, my historical sense has been very provincial because we have the Macamber turnips, so I just went deep with that. And there's a whole world out there of amazing heirlooms. And finding heirlooms also means tracing down parentage of a lot of modern hybrids who, if the parent lines weren't inbred originally, in the early days of hybrids at least, were heirlooms or indigenous seed were either used or appropriated, mostly without consent, to breed a lot of the modern varieties that we have too. So you can trace heirlooms up to the present day in some cases as well. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions here. So I'm going to talk very slowly.
You're all welcome to come off of mute as well if you want to ask a question directly.
Yeah, please do. We have another 15 or so minutes if we want to diverge from seed production and growing to talk about seed politics, seed sovereignty, anything to do with seed whatsoever. I am happily here, grateful for your time, and appreciative of your attention.
Bill, you're welcome to stop screen sharing unless you want to leave one of your particular slides up.
Okay. Oh, I can see everyone now. Hi, everybody. For those of us who have video screens. I, being a farmer, have the privilege of not having to sit on Zoom meetings all day, so this is still a novelty for me, and I'm really enjoying connecting with family that I don't otherwise see in distant areas by seeing videos, because seeing people's faces, seeing people's faces are just excellent. So anybody have questions with anything to do with seed? I'm happy to blurb a little bit about the importance of seed growing, but.
I have a quick question, and thank you for this great presentation. It's so fun to be at a workshop with everyone. How have you found seed viability for onion seed? You know, you read about 2 years and such, but have you tried seed lots beyond then and found that, you know, that you have good germination beyond that?
I'm delighted you asked that. It's actually Sylvia who turned me on to the fact that onion seeds are, all allia are not just viable for 2 years. It really comes down to how well they're dried down and stored. She sent me this year Yellow of Parma, which is one of the yellow storage strains that she keeps. And the seed was 7 years old. And I got 60% germination on that seed, which I think is outstanding because, you know, for those of us who have tried to find that old packet of onion seed because it wasn't available and germinate something that's 2 or 3 years old and had abysmal germination, it is possible. So I think that's a whole other component, and I wish I had more time to just interface with that thought a little bit, is seed viability when you're keeping your own seed is can just extend beyond your wildest imaginations. And you can, without even having to freeze stuff, you can keep some seeds for over a decade and still have good germination on them if they're dried down well and stored appropriately. There's that magic algorithm again of temperature plus relative humidity being less than 100, but the thumbnail test has always worked great for us.
In the chat, Bill is asking, sorry, Mike is asking for you to muse on seed sovereignty for a moment. Great.
So if any of you have seen videos about seed matters or have been involved in seed, this will probably be a familiar introduction, but we have a perfect storm that has formed at the heart of how we grow food. And most of us who are running production farms or gardens are not thinking about the level of the seed to the degree which I would admonish us to. In the last 100 years, the vegetable diversity that our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents enjoyed a century ago, all those different varieties, regionally adapted strains, it's estimated that 93% of those are gone forever. So everything that we have as far as diversity at this point is accounting for about less than 10% of what we had a century ago. There are many efforts underway to pump diversity back into the world on many fronts. I'm grateful to play a very small role in that. At the time of that statistic, 5 major multinational companies controlled over 60% of the world's seed supply. We now have, as many of you know, the merger. I'm on video, but I don't care. This is not a judgment statement. We have mergers of Bayer and Monsanto. We have mergers of Dow and DuPont, which is now Corteva. And we have merger of Syngenta and ChemChina, which means now 3 companies control a vast majority of the world's seed. And that's by diversity. If you're going by acres planted, when we're talking about corn and soy and so forth, you're talking more like 90% of the seed planted is owned by 3 companies, with a number of methods of intellectual property, which has run rampant now, which I'll get to in a second. The consolidation of seed companies is also of great concern because with that, we've lost regionally adapted seed. I'm saying this all now and feeling somewhat dated saying it because there's just been this wonderful explosion. And I don't even think it's just the explosion so much as the mosaic of seed keepers and people doing the good work are finding each other more. But there's a lot that's happening now that's very exciting because when you're growing seed, when you are working with the miracle of our coevolution with plants, our sustenance, you are participating in the solution at the same time that you're addressing the problem, which I think is wonderful. But back to the point of seed keeping now, the consolidation of regionally adapted companies and even smaller cooperative seed houses or family-owned seed businesses is something like 20,000 over the last few decades, which means both the number of companies that have absorbed those seed companies and either dismiss their seed lot altogether or absorb them into their own breeding programs for one reason or another, have been accompanied by a one-size-fits-most breeding approach. So if you are a large seed company and you are working on a hybrid carrot variety, if you have one hybrid carrot variety that fares well across a large range of conditions versus maintaining 13 or 20 different carrot species, one does really well in the Northeast, but not so hot in the South, and one does great in the Pacific Northwest, and so on and so forth. You see the point. It's a lot easier to sell more seed if you're maintaining one that does well over a large range of conditions. Of course, we want things that are adaptable over a large range of conditions, but diversity brings that. Not breeding things to the point where everything does exactly what you want it to do until it doesn't and breaks down, because the breakdown in a lot of the inbreeding inherent within hybrid varieties, I mean F1 hybrids specifically, the breakdown from my experience and understanding is not the exception to the rule, it is the rule itself. So whether through planned obsolescence or through a variety's inability to adapt to mutations of pathogens and things like that because of a lack of diversity, then that variety disappears. Even if it's a good variety for us, it might not be good for those 4 big spinach growers, and poof, there it goes. So there are many reasons to care about seed. Not having seed that's adapted to bioregions, I think in a time of climate disruption, disaster, chaos, however you choose to call it, speaks for itself. If we have no diversity and we have major disruption in the way that climate patterns are happening, advents of new pests and diseases that are happening on an annual basis, then you have varieties that can't adapt, and you cannot continue the poem of our coevolution with plant varieties. So having enough diversity in a bioregionally adapted variety also ensures that you can share that diverse gene pool that's all doing more or less the same thing to constitute a variety with people elsewhere around the country and world. And I'm doing this and others are doing this now. So if I get seeds from someone who's breeding in the mountains of Colorado or, you know, in the mesas of New Mexico, as long as there's enough diversity in there, then there's the potential for that to be adapted to your bioregion. So if it's a really good variety and it has that inherent diversity, it doesn't matter if it's grown in your region initially or not, because there's enough in there to play with and work with. And I think that's extremely important in this time of climate disruption, because if we're relying on a handful of very large companies whose vested interest, as it should be, being a good capitalist business, is selling seed as much as possible, then we should have great concern with that seed system breaking down as we're seeing other systems of dysfunctionality, injustice, oppression, and so forth breaking down before our very eyes. So there are a number of reasons to care about seed. This is the brushstroke sentiment about environment and political, but then of course there's the obvious culture of seed. Seeds are stories. They're stories of migration, they're stories of struggle and mass exodus, and stories of genocide, and stories of positive cultural exchanges at certain points in history as well. And with preserving these seeds, we're preserving these stories. And so, you know, this applies more obviously to the seeds of your heirloom varieties and whatnot, but any seed has a story. You know, you could have a neighbor who developed a killer tomato or stumbled upon some accidental outcross in her garden and paid attention enough and was astute enough to save that and has an excellent variety. And the story about that being passed on and everything that comes with it accompanies the seed itself. So for those of us who come from traditions, particularly indigenous traditions, where the seeds are ancestors and seeds are linked to the past. There's a much richer connection than ordering from the catalog and getting it and planting it. Even if you plant it with right livelihood and great reverence, there are so many hands that have touched everything that we eat, that have shaped it and blessed it in a way that allowed it to reach us. And I think we can never undermine that. And so, not to really plug what we're doing with Freed Seed Federation, but I think we're a small part of a much broader mosaic of people who are reimagining what alternative community-based seed systems look like. You know, this was something that when I was on my soapbox 10 years ago about this, felt kind of like a pipe dream that we just needed to stick with. And now, because of the times, because of the collective momentum, because people are coming together and thinking creatively and making new ways where ways are not, alternative community systems are not only possible, they're necessary to a certain degree. Because if any of you who were not commercial seed producers tried to order seeds this year after April, I think it speaks for itself. Every single seed company, at least in the Northeast, was backed up by 4 to 6 weeks or was shut down until June. The supply chain went pop. And immediately, if we waited too damn long to get those tomato seeds, better luck next year. Hopefully you have something that was preserved, you know, well enough that you can regrow it for the year to come. This is, with the disruption in supply chains and globalization, I mean, I'm not spouting conspiracy theory here. I think most of you who are attending NOFA workshops have the understanding that systems are broken. And the way we fix these broken systems are not to stick our finger in the dam, but to render them irrelevant. And the way that we render them irrelevant is by working together and cooperating. And what we can produce is not only just as good as what large companies can do, it's better. And I see that on my farm every single day by seed that I and my peers have grown, and my wife and I have grown. There is no better time than right now. If you have a garden, you can grow seed. It doesn't matter how small it is. Find what's attractive to you. Find other people. Find something that fits well within your system. And please care for the seeds, because they need us and they are calling to us.
Yeah.
You're here.
You're here.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
It's my pleasure.
Want to point your attention to one last thing in the chat. Maybe that'll wrap us up.
Okay.
Wes is asking, you know, the best way to store seed in the average home. Any setup?
Okay. Got it. Best way to store seed at home is north-facing closet, pretty much. An area that's out of sunlight, that's out of fluctuating temperatures, and is hopefully cool enough. We've stored seed, you know, in compromised situations in a house of 75 degrees. And as long as those seeds were stored well, either in a sealed jar or in seed packets in a plastic bin or something like that, and moisture can't get in there, the fact that it's warm in there is not the end of the world. It's really the oscillating temperatures, because what oscillating temperatures do to a seed is try to wake it up. If the seed feels warm after it's been cold for a while, really fast, it's suddenly saying, wait a second, it's time to start stretching out here a little bit and get my little cotyledons ready and going for it. And that can dramatically cut down on the viability of a seed, much more so than a seed that's stored in a warm room. If it's in a warm room and the temperature's relatively stable and the humidity is not permeating wherever your seed is, then you're probably good. And most seed keepers will agree that despite all of our hopes and dreams of having seed vaults and cryogenic freezing, a north-facing closet does the trick in most cases too. As long as you don't have children that are curious, they can get at it, because that also happens too. Yeah, short of that, I mean, another thing that we're doing on the farm, because part of our mission with Freed Seed Federation is to be a hub for our seed growing community here, is that we were gifted from another farm who was clearing out a barn a 4x8 prefab walk-in cooler. And so we're going to retrofit that with a dehumidifier and an air conditioner. And so that will suffice for us to keep seed in long-term storage for stuff that we don't want to freeze, that we don't know what will become of it in 20 or 25 years, or in some cases where you have the last 5 or 6 beans potentially of a variety that may no longer exist. The stakes are greater than leaving them in your north-facing closet. So don't do that with rare seed. But do that with other seed. And if you do freeze seed, I will also say just something that I found really important that I learned by doing was if you have anything that's in a freezer, before you open that jar up or open that bag up, when you pull yeah, I see a nod up there. If you pull that out of the freezer, all the moisture goes poof. Let it sit and get to room temperature before you open the bag or crack the jar. It's simple, and it will save you a headache of something that you tried to pull out from storage and just potentially wrecked in a matter of 30 seconds to a minute. So if you are freezing things, look up. There are a number of different ways to freeze things, and some things tolerate freezing better than others. And there are very sophisticated methods of freezing to which none of us will probably ever have the privilege of doing. But if you do decide to freeze, just do a little homework first before you do it. It's otherwise straightforward. A couple bags and a tight seal will usually do it. It's 8:31. Please, if anyone has questions or wants to know more, and I can't share anymore, but williamjbraun@gmail.com is my email. It's also in the program, I think, too, Jason, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere in there. You can find me. I'm around. I would love to talk more. I would love to support all of you in the wonderful work that you're doing. Thank you for your time. I hope everyone stays safe and sane and continues to feel that we are stronger together. So thank you all so much. I see Paul from Mowing Seeds. Paul, I wish we had more of a chance to hear from you. I'm sure you have much more insight, but also check out Mowing. They're an excellent regional company, and they do a lot of good work. So hope to connect with you soon. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Be well in your lives and livelihoods, and hope to run into you sometime on the farm or elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill. Very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining. It's nice to see you. And feel free to contact Bill, as he mentioned. I think that's something I appreciate a lot about the seed community that we have, is that you guys really believe it's better together. Like, you guys really
collaboration, not competition.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you very much. It's very inspiring. I learned a lot myself, and it was nice to see you all.